Welcome to Hiking with Anderson. We once again have Michel Plato with us. So it's Hiking with Anderson and Plato, and we really are hiking. We should tell people.
Yeah. I'm kind of getting a little warm out here today, up in the Colorado Rockies right now.
But we are on I'd say it's a medium busy trail. So we may hear people walking around in the background.
Nice little breeze going on though. But That's pretty good.
And we wanted to set up a good view for you as we continue a series on critical theory. And today, Michel's actually published work on both posthumanism and transhumanism. So this video is going to be about posthumanism. He's going to help us understand what is that? What does it teach about human nature and good life? So why don't you just start us off? What is posthumanism?
Okay, well, first of all, just as a little bit of a by the by, that we are going to be doing two videos here.
Yep.
So first on post and transhumanism, and just to sort of clarify, the terms often in our culture are used interchangeably. A lot of people sort of seem to think they're the same thing. They're really not. And a number of the major theorists in the areas of these really see themselves that they have very different intellectual origins and traditions behind them, and very different goals behind them. So it's important to recognize posthumanism is a completely different thing from
if you don't know about them, you might just lump them in together. But
and that you hear that a lot in the media, and that people will just sort of post or trans, whatever. But they're very different things, and they've got very different functions and purposes. Posthumanism, to begin with, is really like what it says. It's post-humanism. And that encompasses two things. It encompasses being post-humanism, which is a movement that began in Europe, that many people would say, I mean, depending on how you define it, a lot of people would sort of see the Renaissance perhaps in Europe as a starting point for modern humanism.
You probably have a trace a line like from the say Erasmus as a humanist.
That's right.
All the way to what's called secular humanism. And so as secular humanism fails to provide meaning, this is the next step.
Right. A good image of that would be, for example, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, where the idea is man the measure of all things. Humanism sort of sees humanity as the center of things, and really it's all about us being in control and in charge of the world, as it were, and the like. Well, after the Second World War, you started to get a number of people criticizing that sort of like, humanism, especially secularism, like secular humanism, led to a lot of the atrocities of the Holocaust and the Second World War. And a lot of people started looking for an alternative. And you end up getting what many would refer to as the anti-humanist movement first.
You and I talked before about how the world wars seem to push people away from God.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Compared to some wars, we said like the American Civil War seemed to have a different effect. Mm-hmm. But in Europe, certainly, there seemed to be it's a move away from God, but it's also a suspicion of this idea of especially humanity and reason.
Mm-hmm. The collapse of the modern project.
Right, and sort of two of the central figures. One is a 19th century figure by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is the first one who really criticizes or critiques sort of overall ideas that that there is some kind of larger meaning to the world, and also the possibilities of reason. He's become sort of almost in a way the first kind of irrationalist philosopher in some way, like very strong mistrust of reason. And then you have, after the Second World War, another thinker, probably one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault, one of his most famous lines is what he calls the death of man. And he doesn't mean by the death of man like physical human death, but the ideas of what human beings are, that humanity and individuals have an essence to them. And that whole idea disappears. And so under the...
So it's interesting, just real quick. Yeah. So you have Nietzsche's death of God.
Yes, death of God, that's right.
Death of man. So death of God, death of man. They follow in that order.
And they follow exactly. God dies, and then after Second World War, the consequence, the death of man. And what they mean by that is there's no essence, there's no guiding principles, there's nothing that makes a human being unique or special. And so basically it becomes a project we could call of self-creation, that you can sort of, after this, you start to sort of see yourselves, or you can reinvent yourself, is kind of what Foucault does. Along with this, you start to see a number of other movements that begin to emerge, like post-colonialism, which we've talked about before, radical feminism. A good example of this is the French theorist Luce Irigaray, and she makes the argument that very much against the Vitruvian model, like, why does that represent? Why is white male European, the ideal human.
The Renaissance man.
Yeah, why does that represent humanity? What about me? What about others? And so you start to get a very strong feminist critique. And then by about the 1980s and 90s, you do start to see a new movement. So many people would call this the anti-humanist. Let's eliminate humanism. Yeah. What do we have? By the 80s and 90s, we start to see a replacement come into place. And this is post-humanism. And really by the turn of the millennium, it starts to kick off. And really in the last 15 years is when we've seen the massive growth. So this is like the thing of the moment. It's the hot philosophy of the moment. Okay. And there's a few things about it I just sort of mentioned. An important figure in this is, starting in the 1980s, was an American thinker by the name of Donna Haraway. In what she wrote a thing called the Cyborg Manifesto, where she takes the cyborg. We all know the cyborg from science fiction, where and she says, well, you look at it, the cyborg. It's neither male nor female. Is it human? Is it machine? Is it natural? Unnatural?
Yeah.
And she sort of shows that it crosses boundaries in a way, and that's what posthumanism does. It basically eliminates the idea that humans are special. For example, we talk about human rights. Well, why don't animals have human rights? Why don't machines? Why don't environments have human rights? What makes us so special? Yeah. And posthumanism is trying to sort of look at all of us, what we would call the former humans, as being part of this larger sort of new humanity.
So it's anti-essentialist.
It's anti-essentialist,
in a sense. So not only turning away from modern philosophy, but it would critique, say, Plato and Aristotle as essentialists who say there's a form or an idea for a thing. So here they would say there's no human nature.
A big influence of this happens sort of metaphysically foundationally. And in the late 1960s, the French theorist Luce Althusser was looking for an alternative to the Hegelian dialectic, which gives us Marxism. They were Marxists. They couldn't see Marxism going anywhere, and the Hegelian idea that there's this inevitable evolutionary progress. And so he actually starts to turn and looking back to Baruch Spinoza. And another guy by the name of Pierre Macharin actually writes a famous book called Hegel or Spinoza, where he basically says, hey, Spinoza's view, where what we call monism is the replacement. Everything is one in a way. There is no difference between mind and matter, or nature and God, or humans and nature. We're all one in a way. This sort of monistic, some would call, if you would use a religious term, pantheistic view. This really sort of starts to emerge. Indeed, probably one of the leading theorists in posthumanism today, an Italian-Australian professor who teaches in Utrecht by the name of Rosi Braidotti. She writes a lot about this, and she actually makes the argument. She figures Spinoza will become the key philosopher of the 21st century. That basically what we have to look at is everything is matter, but what you call smart matter. So what your brain is, it just happens to be a particularly more complex area of matter, but that there's a kind of thinking quality to all matter. Another term for this is what's called panpsychism. And this really becomes the foundation for it. So there is no essence, there's no form. Everything is basically one. And
so it's interesting, just for the history of ideas.
Yes.
Spinoza was always on that side of a monism.
Yes.
And Descartes on the other side. And so this is a kind of
the
idea
spirit
here,
and matter.
Matter and spirit, two things, the kind of dualism. So this has always been one of the critiques of modernity is too Cartesian. So although Spinoza is a modern philosopher in the history of modern European philosophy, he's often viewed as being more connected with the non-modern philosophies of monism.
That's right. And so it's very anti-Cartesian is posthumanism. So it sort of looks at, like I said, sort of this rediscovery in a way. Two key other thinkers, and there's a lot of thinkers in this because it's a very complex movement that's developed, were Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. They wrote a couple of very important books called Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, and they really kind of take the Spinozist idea and they talk about what is the future for humanity, and it's basically merging with other forms, with other realities, that we're not basically exclusive and distinct and different. Rosi Braidotti actually calls it human becoming animal, human becoming environment, human becoming machine. That this is the goal in some sort of way.
Yeah.
And so what posthumanism does is it takes a lot of the, shall we call the liberation thinking of the 20th century, post-colonialism, feminism, anti-racism theories, mixes it with a lot of science and technology, because they see science and technology, for example, genetics might actually physically allow humans and animals to merge, or cybernetics will allow computers and humans to merge, that will sort of dissipate ourselves into the all one reality.
Right.
And then you combine it with Nietzsche and Foucault for the whole self-creative. And it's in many ways, now there's a lot of problems with it, but you can also begin to see, I think it's a very exciting and dynamic field. There's a lot of energy behind it, because we're reinventing everything.
It's the latest idea.
It's the latest idea,
With
but it's drawn.
no horizons.
That's right. Yeah, there's limitless horizons. It's basically wiped the slate clean of how we've understood humanity, and what it means to be an individual, and we're sort of starting right over from scratch.
Yeah.
And like I said, with all of the different influences, it gives us a lot of possibilities. But again, the key feature is it's a diminishment of the human being in some sort of way, that we're nothing special in some sort of way. But they wouldn't look at that as a negative. They would always say, no, look at, we're affirming, for example, animals. Look at how great and wonderful animals are. We could draw from animals. Look at computers when AI develops, how we'll be able to interact with that. Look at the environments. I mean, ecosystems like we have around us are so complex.
So it's interesting. That's where the Cartesian critique comes in, because the critique of Descartes is always that he objectified nature into a machine that is something we can destroy. It doesn't matter.
Right.
You can treat animals like just machines with no feelings.
Right.
So this is a reaction to that, but it's interesting also that it's a reaction to the Christian view of kinds of things. So not only does it say there is no God who created the world, all is one, it also denies that humans are one kind, animals are one kind, and instead all of those merge. So then you lose the nature of things, really. That anti-essentialism. So,
well, that's why I think this is where it's got a stronger base with somebody like Spinoza, because Spinoza radically rethought the whole metaphysical foundation of reality. And so you can say, well, what is this based on? So for example, posthumanism comes after what many people would know as postmodernism. And one of the big criticisms of postmodernism is just all relative. Well, you have your truth, I have my truth. I mean, that's kind of, it's one of the criticisms that's always been very detrimental, and sort of like the Achilles heel of postmodernism. Posthumanism says, no, what you've got is everything is one, and what we've got is multi-perspectival. So you have a different view of the truth than I do, because we're all part of the one, but we've got different angles and different approaches to it.
The blind man and the elephant.
The blind man and the elephant, kind of sort of the way they would look at it. So we're getting different elements of the truth. And so they figure, I mean, a lot of the post-humanists would see that as one of the philosophically greater strengths of it over postmodernism, which seems to be a movement that's very much in decline right now. So I think post-humanism is definitely going to be something. It's extremely popular in the universities. We see it very much in humanities departments, much more than we would say in philosophy departments. And like I said, it seems to be very much growing in Europe and North America.
And so in one way, as you said, it's new. It's the new thing that can offer some new ways of solving problems. But in another way, it's the same old, which is there is no God, the creator, all is one. And so the challenge, the lines of demarcation, at least in that sense, are very clear. It's always that, right? Either God alone is eternal or all things are eternal. And this is another version of that. So it wouldn't be surprising to see family relationships with past forms of monism. So even though it's new, it's going to recapitulate some of the same patterns.
I mean, it's very much, I mean, if you're looking for a religious comparison, it is the old term that even was applied, I mean, it was originally applied to Spinoza's pantheism. And we do see traditions, other traditions, which kind of make that universal claim.
And you mentioned panpsychism.
Panpsychism is another term that relates. So a lot of it is also, again, people often call the foundation for this new materialism, and or vitalism. Vital materialism, and that's the panpsychism, that matter is not just sort of this inert matter, and that mind is sort of this active principle. All matter possesses this kind of vitality to it.
That's kind of what's interesting. I'm always fascinated in Acts 17 when Paul goes to Athens. It says the philosophers like to sit around talking about the latest ideas. And yet the ideas they were talking about were really just the same old ideas. And so vitalism and panpsychism, we have Greek representatives of that in ancient philosophy. So it's not, in that sense, it's not new. And that's one of the things I want to do these videos for, is to help people know the current ideas, but also how they repeat old patterns as we think about the knowledge of God.
Old patterns with a lot more mechanisms and stuff behind it now, certainly with all these philosophical traditions. You attach it to things like neuroscience and modern technologies, it certainly gives it a patina.
It seems like cutting edge.
It's all cutting edge. This has never been, isn't this amazing? You know, what they'll look at things like, again, Braidotti, who's quite an energetic enthusiast. She's well worth watching. There's lots of YouTube videos of her. She's a very, I think she's a very charming person in a way. I've actually met her before, and she's just got this real energy, and like she's a real proselytizer for this. But you know, she actually said at one point when the Dolly the sheep happened, and it was basically a genetically created the first clone sheep. I think many people remember it. And she actually referred to this. I thought it was so fascinating, in a talk I heard her give, where she said, "This is the end of biblical reproduction." She actually used that phrase, the end of biblical reproduction, because you don't need to have mom and dad anymore to produce. We'll do it in a lab. What she didn't point out is, of course, Dolly the sheep died only very shortly after. And this is one of these things
that a lot. They got to do fine tuning.
This is where I think a lot of, aside from the philosophical critique we can have, there are other elements of the science which aren't matching so much a lot of the arguments that they're putting forward.
Well, and the science ethics behind many of these experimentations, because you'll get Dolly, but you'll have numerous failed attempts that cause a lot of pain. So if we're going to critique Descartes for objectifying animals and treating like machines, well, we don't want to then do the same thing in this other view and allow scientific experimentation that is producing harm. So
I don't want to get the idea that's the post-humanists are pushing that in you know, that sort of thing. I mean to give them their due, there's a very strong ethical and moral conscience behind them. And I mean, we got to understand that. It's, again, where is the direction coming from, though? That's the problem. What is the foundation
what came to mind
of it?
For me was a recent lab experiment on a male mouse to make him have a womb and produce babies. But the ethicists pointed out all the suffering. I mean, it wasn't actually a womb inside a male mouse. It was all kinds of suffering imposed on this creature to get the scientific outcome that they wanted. So that's what was on my mind.
It is true, and that's the thing. I think there's this unintentional thing that there's not often drawn to, but
So good. Well, so that's introduction to posthumanism.
Yes.
And now we're going to continue our hike, and we'll do
find another location. Maybe this is actually a really nice location you chose here.
The thing about where we're at is it's filled with nice locations. So we'll next talk about transhumanism. And get the philosopher Plato to help us out on hiking with Anderson. So thanks for joining us today.